Morning, hi, Graham Vincent, violin maker and musician. It's Q&A time again, number 10, I believe. So I've got some questions, so let's crack on. I'm sure some of you know that I run a Facebook group called Violin Making Discussion Group, I think it's called. Anyway, I'll put a link below. And some of these questions come from that. Other ones are questions that were left on last week's Q&A. And although you probably would enjoy the Violin Making Discussion Group as well, do leave any questions you have about violin making on this week's Q&A, and I will try to tackle them next week. Okay, so let's dive straight in. Last week, no, it wasn't as part of the Q&A, but last week I did a video which was just a sort of catch up of what I was up to in the workshop, and I showed I was just making a new plate for working on the violin. And one thing that seems to have interested a lot of people was the method I use for holding this in the vise. Basically what I have is a round piece attached to the plate, glued and screwed onto the plate, and then there's an arm on the top which is free to rotate, and that holds these two blocks, and they are just held in one place with one screw so that they're free to actually sort of move on that arm. So basically the whole thing can move around, and then when you put it in the vise and when the vise grips this, and this is something the vise finds very easy to grip because it's got two parallel faces, suddenly the whole thing is locked in place. I didn't get the top part of it right on this one, so this is actually currently back on a shelf. And my old favourite, which is a bit of a dog's dinner, but it's got the same mechanism, is back on the bench. This one, I mean, it couldn't be any simpler really. I've just got two. Well, there's a cutout it's all screwed in. There's a cutout underneath this, so I can use this. I can put an arched top in the other way up as well, but basically this is held by these little thin bits of board on the top. It's got slotted screws on that one. It's got slots which the screws are in on this one side, so this one can just be pushed tight against the top to hold it in place. Hope that makes sense. Anyway, yeah, it works really nicely. You put it in the vise, and it means you can turn the top round to wherever you fancy working on it, and then do the vise, and it's firmly locked in place. So yeah, that's that. The history, the background to how I got to that particular design. It all started with one of these. I'm sure many of you will have seen these Stanley vices. They are, all due respect to Stanley, they're half of a really amazing idea. The top half is great, and this joint is such a good idea, but then everything that happens below here is kind of less than satisfactory. This arm is so short that you can't really tighten this very easily. You bang your fingers on it and everything, so it just drives you nuts. So I actually thought, why don't I just grip it in the vise? So that's what I did. I've got two plates which again are kind of able to move a little bit. You see, that's not really gripping it at the moment. That ball is now set into just a large circular hole on each side, and I'm sure you can see how this is going to work. Sorry, I should have adjusted the vise. It's got adjusted from that other thing. There we go. You basically pop it in the vise. It's a bit difficult to do with one hand only, and then you just tighten it up, and now that's completely lock solid. So that was then obviously spawned my thinking for how to do the base plate as well. So yeah, I did a video on this actually. It's a really, really good, if you happen to have one of these vices, it's a really quick modification to make. turns it from being kind of useful to being incredibly useful. So there we go. Yeah, right. Anyway, that's the first, well, it wasn't really a question, observation. Second, we do have a question from the group. Okay. How does one know when their instruments are high enough quality for someone else to want to buy or play one? I've only built 6 violins so far, and I'd consider my products nowhere near good enough to have someone else play them or buy them yet. But I'm curious what I do with 10 or 20 or more of them in a few years. What do other people do with them? I wouldn't mind donating to a worthy cause like a school orchestra, but I'd also be very nervous about giving someone something that wasn't as serviceable as a £500 Chinese instrument they might otherwise have. My kids all played Eastman violins in school, and to be honest, they play perfectly fine at that price, and I'm nervous that I couldn't make something better. Sorry for the ramble, just out of wall hangers and needing to order some more, and it did make me ponder what others in this group are doing once you have more than your own household can use. Thanks. Good question. Yeah, so what I did basically is I kept the first one. The second one I made as a present for my daughter, and from that point onwards I started selling them. I mean, my intention was always to make them and sell them, so I worked really hard to make sure that I got other people to play them and comment on them, and it was quite painful to hear some of those comments on the first one, but I like to think I'm reasonably objective when it comes to looking at my own work, so you know, it wasn't totally unexpected, and it was just listening to the truth effectively. So I would say to make yourself happy medium to long term making instruments, you want to be making the best instruments you can make, and that means getting people to play them and listen to what they say and improve. So that wasn't the question. So to answer the question, I would suggest getting people to play them is better than them being on display. So make sure they are worth playing, and if there's something wrong with a particular instrument that means it can't, you know, it isn't easy to play, then actually revisit it, go back, rework that violin until it is suitable for playing. At that point, I mean, there are plenty of people who can't afford a violin who would like to play, and I do think, I mean, you suggest, you know, you wouldn't mind donating them to a school orchestra or something. Perhaps one of the best things to do might be to go to several local teachers and say, look, I make violins. At this point, I don't think they're of a quality where I can, or that I particularly want to sell. However, they are of a sufficient quality to play. It occurred to me that you may have pupils who are looking to buy a full-size instrument, or you know, need to upgrade slightly. If you would like, I'm more than happy to let you have these as loan instruments to give them to people who you feel are appropriate for them. So I'm sure that you would be able to find people who would put you in touch with other, you know, with kids and adults who would be delighted to have a free instrument, even just on loan, so that they could get going. Yeah, that's probably my best suggestion. Yeah, I think that's probably the most sensible thing I would say. I mean, I've mentioned this before. I did some of my earlier ones. I did actually sell on eBay for not very much money. I was quite happy with that. I've always worked on the basis that it's good to sell the violins. It's good to, you know, get your cash flow, you know, so to speak, get money in, and have people playing your instruments is much better than them not being played. Next question, this is in the group as well. Has anybody worked with box elder maple? I was told it's too soft for instrument making. Does anyone know this to be true? And this just goes back to my general thinking about timbers generally. Pick up a piece of timber and tap it. And if it has a lovely ringy sound to it, then you can use it. If it doesn't, if it's dull, if it goes thud, then don't use it. It's as simple as that. Yes, there are structural considerations. Is it full of cracks or splits and so on? So really, when it comes to making a violin, if you have a choice of timber, you should be using the bits that ring most, because if you have timber that absorbs sound, then it will behave in the same way when it's part of an instrument. You'll have an instrument that doesn't, make the most of the energy going in, but just absorbs it. So I think it's exactly the same answer to that as I always give about timber choices, really. Then we had another question. I'm sorry, I haven't managed to copy across people's names on these first few questions. That was a bit silly of me, but you may know who you are as we go. This is a question about design and not building. I have read that some violins taper the ribs from the back towards the neck. Some leave the back flat and taper the top plate side. I measured 3 of my violins and one tapers and the other 2 do not. I'm currently laying out a quinary pattern for 5 strings, so thoughts on the subject are greatly appreciated. Okay, yeah, that's, where are we? Rib garland. Basically, some people have the end block thicker, deeper than the top block. Generally, ribs are sort of rarely less than 30 mil. I personally, at this point in time, and I'm not saying it's not going to change in the future, but at this point in time, and for my last 45 violins, I have made them all at 30 mil, and that served me well, and I'm pretty happy with that. A lot of people will have 30 mil at the neck and 31 or 32 at the base. Some people will have a straight taper, and other people will have a curve, effectively. So they will make the plate, obviously with a flat, and the ribs will have a curve, and so there's a slight spring, there's a tension when it's put on. And people kind of maintain that this somehow improves the sound. So that may or may not be the case, but all I know is to actually sort of cramp that down, basically it requires little more than finger pressure to actually sort of just get that to seat down. And you have to ask yourself, in a system like the violin, whether there is enormous tension from the strings, is a little tiny bit of tension, inconsequential in my opinion, little bit of tension in the front, really going to make any difference? It's like, it must be a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of the tension compared with the percentage, with the tension imposed upon the system by the strings. So that's my opinion on it. I think more importantly, maybe, is that it does very slightly increase the volume of the cavity, so which may be a good thing or it may not be a good thing. Because in my experience, the internal volume, and this is going to be slightly contentious, but the internal volume isn't necessarily the biggest determinant in how the thing sounds, even in response to bass. But there we go. Particularly with the violin, where you don't always want a particularly good bass response. It's a funny little instrument, it really is. So, have I answered that question? Yeah. It's interesting that the questioner asks, or states that basically he's measured 3 and 2 of them don't have a taper and 1 of them does. I personally would have expected that it would have been, more had a slight taper than didn't. But obviously, 3 is not the world's biggest sample group, so it could just be that. Right. Okay, I have a history of disappointing people in my life. DIY Dark Matter has sent in, well, it's a question really about the sound in the background, because in the last video you could hear this tick, 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 tick going on. And Graham, I love your clock. I don't know what it looks like or where you have it, but I'm a clock nut and I love your clock. Now, I've not seen it, but I would love to. Does it chime? Does it have a pendulum? It sounds like it does. Do you have to wind it? And yeah, basically DIY Dark Matter asks a lot of questions about the clock. So DIY Dark Matter, this is my normal heating source here, okay? Yeah, no, there's the wood for the next few days. But when I can't be bothered to do that, I have this Chinese thing in the corner, and it produces a reasonable amount of heat for the workshop at a fairly low cost. And it has here a high pressure diesel pump, which just pulses. So what you could hear in the background, I'm afraid, wasn't some wonderful antique clock, although I wish it had been, and that would be a lovely addition for the workshop. It was just my little diesel pump ticking away. I'm so sorry. Forgive me. Okay. Yeah, next question. Have you put a truss rod in a violin, and what do you think about it? Okay. I don't think this is a goer or is necessary for various reasons. Let me just grab this. Okay. That piece of wood there is the neck. That distance there is the neck. It's quite thick, and it's also got a great big piece of another material on the top, maybe ebony, maybe something else. Can you imagine having that and trying to bend it? Okay. A guitar neck is about that long, and yes, you can imagine, you put it down on the bench and lean on it, you can imagine making it bend slightly, but a little piece that long, you're not going to be able to bend it. Any movement and so on in the violin is nothing to do really with that piece. It's to do with this junction here with the violin, because you're talking about something that's very lightly built here versus something that's got a real intrinsic strength of its own here. So putting a truss rod in with a view to changing the action on the violin is basically a no-go. You might, I think a couple of American makers have used adjustable necks where, you can actually adjust the angle by tightening a nut or something here. Now that is a sensible approach, although personally it's not one that I'd ever adopt, because I think it's pretty unsightly and also basically unnecessary. The little movements in the body and so on can be adjusted by planing the fingerboard. Larger movements don't happen that often and should be corrected by resetting the neck, which is, reasonably expensive, but nevertheless, that's the way to do it. The idea of having a truss rod, I think it's a non-starter, in all honesty. Sorry. Right. Question from Andrew Parrish. I've noticed that most violins only have fine tuners on the E string. Is this the sign of a good violin that's easy to tune, or just personal preference? Okay, it's historically gut strings used to be used on violins, and as you increase the tension on gut strings, they stretch quite a lot. So in the tuning process, you actually had more movement on the peg than you do with something like a steel string. So those pegs were easier to use with gut strings than they are with with synthetic or steel chord strings. For quite a long period of the 20th century, and about the time when things like fine tuners were becoming more popular, you would have a set of gut strings with a steel E. Gut strings were easy to tune, lots of movement on the peg. The E string, which had almost no stretch in the actual string when you were tuning it, was really finicky, you know. So that one really did need a fine tuner. And so the classical world came to accept one tuner on the E string. We've kind of moved on a little bit from there because very, very, very few people use gut strings. No, not very few, but let's say the majority of people don't use gut strings. And now you have generally people playing with steel chord strings or synthetic chord strings. And both of them are more hard to tune than gut strings. In the classical world, they have been unwilling to accept the compromise of extra weight from fine tuners. And so they've maintained that kind of setup with just having the fine tuner on the steel E. In other things like the folk world and sometimes jazz and so on, you do see people with just fine tuners on everything, on all four strings. And for example, for my performing violin, I have geared pegs, so I've got effectively fine tuning at the scroll, and I also have fine tuners on the tailpiece. So I've got complete overkill, really. So I hope that kind of answers your question, really. There is a historical reason for it. At one point in time, it was a sensible approach, but it's kind of tradition and formality has kind of kept it that way, with some reasonable argument about additional weight and so on in the classical world. And then in other situations, some do and some don't adopt it, really. So there we go. I think there's a certain element of, well, I really know what I'm doing. I don't need the ease of all these fine tuners. I think there's perhaps a little element of that. Snobbishness, is that the right word? I don't like the word snobbishness, but something like that. So that's my humble opinion. Okay, now this is a really interesting question from Digdoon. A question for next week. When making a violin with a one-piece back, what way should you have the grain running? I'm not sure of what side of the timber to put the ribs. I hope you know what I mean here. Sorry if it's a poor description. It's not a poor description. I know exactly what you're talking about. It would be nice if I had a chunk of timber to show you, but of course I've just split all those logs up yesterday. But let's imagine this lovely little mallet, which I'm using a lot now. Imagine those are the annual rings. One-piece backs are normally slab cut. That is to say that they're run through the sawmill like that. Okay? And the question is, effectively, should you have, in your one-piece back, looking at the end of it, should you have the grain running like that or running like that? Now, I personally have always put the grain running like that. If you use bird's eye maple, for example, you would by default have to have it running like that, because the appearance of bird's eye is from the outside of the board. If you have it the other way up, the little bird's eyes look strange. They look inverted because the chatoyance in those little local deformities, it needs to be with the grain running that way. And I've just carried that across. I think I tend to use it that way. I think because of the very thin nature of the actual violin back, because of its form, it would cope with movement in either way. So I don't actually believe it's critical, but that's the way that I do it. Please, if you know better, let us know. But for me, that's how I do it. So I can only answer your question from my experience, and that's my thoughts on it. Okay, well this is interesting as well. This is another question from DIY Dark Matter. My question is, as a wood carver myself, I know for a fact that carving green wood is easier. It is known that Stradivarius also carved violins out of green wood. He also burned many of his violins. Do you think he did this? Do you think he did this to the violin warping as he dried it, or maybe it cracked from drying too fast? Okay. I don't know if we do know that Stradivarius carved violins from green wood. We do know certainly that he used timber that was sometimes only 2 or 3 years old, so was not really anything like as seasoned as a lot of people choose nowadays. I mean, there has become a little bit of an obsession about how well seasoned timber is, and as I just said, relating to the choice of grain direction on the one-piece back, the actual form of the violin really constrains or allows movement without damaging the actual structure of the violin to an extent. I wouldn't want to go as far as carving a violin from green wood, because you get, you know, a huge amount of movement and shrinkage initially, whereas, you know, the difference in shrinkage from, you know, cut down to 2 years old is massive compared with 2 years to 10 years. It's a much smaller kind of degree of movement. So I'm waffling a little bit, but when you say he also burned many of his violins, I don't know how true that is or not. I've not really heard of that. But actually sort of maintaining the quality by, you know, quality control, stamping on something he didn't like, that's fair enough. Because he had an extremely good reputation even during his lifetime. He was a fairly well-off individual because he had a very successful business. But yes, I mean, no, for wood carving, gosh, you're so right. Carving green wood is so much easier, and it's almost like carving soap compared with carving sort of seasoned timber. But no, as I say, because of the amount that it does move, it's not something I would consider personally, not for a violin. Certainly, when fairly fresh, new green, if you like, green wood is used, and it sometimes in the past, shall we say, some of the Chinese manufacturers particularly had a reputation for using fairly unseasoned timber. And that's, I'm not trying to sort of talk badly about Chinese violins, because there's some amazing violins coming from China. There really are some fantastic violins coming from China. But the problems that used to arrive in those situations weren't the body sort of shrinking and distorting. They tended to present themselves as problems with the neck, in my limited experience of those violins. Okay, so yeah, it's the answer to the question, no, I wouldn't consider using it. I think you could get away with it in some respects and not in other respects. But using timber that's 2 or 3 years seasoned, which they certainly know that Stradivarius and Guarneri did, yeah, probably wouldn't do it nowadays, but they got away with it and they knew what they were doing. Monty Latham, you mentioned talking about files you use. Do you think, he asked this question, I think, more than once, and I've kind of never got around to it. The files I use. Okay, bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to gather a few of them. Right. Yes. So the files I use, there is the absolute classic hand cut rasp. Wonderful. Although this one is a little bit blunt because I've had it for like 40 years and I need another one. And I haven't found exactly the one I want to spend all that money on yet. I have got some smaller hand cut ones, which I do use quite a bit. The Japanese saw file is such an amazing tool. Yeah, love this. I've only had one for the last 18 months. It's great, really good. Then I do use, I think what you probably call a mill file, really, for some sort of finer work. I use a sort of, I think this is what's generally referred to as a bastard cut in the UK. It's called a bastard cut. I don't know if that's the same in America, but these are fairly cheap files that I buy, and I normally break the plastic handles off and turn a nice handle for them because I just prefer using them like that. And then the last thing that I use a great amount is various diamond needle files, and these aren't expensive. And again, that's just a little handle I turned to make it nicer to use. But I mean, I use probably about 50% diamond ones, and also the other. Sorry, I almost forgot to mention. And then I do use just a whole vast array of standard sort of needle files. I do like diamond files. They clog quite quickly, but top tip here, and I've never seen anyone else do this, but it works so well. If you have a cup of hot water on the bench, you can just dip the diamond file into that, and any wood clogging the surface immediately swells up and just comes off, and you can just do that, dry it, and on you go. And one of the nice things about the diamond file is I think it's the same reason that these hand cut files work so nicely, is there's a complete randomness to the distribution of the actual sort of diamond chips, so to speak. So they don't tend to vibrate, nor do they tend to leave lines. There's a much sort of flatter surface, if you like, and again, that's the reason that this design works so well, because nowhere is there a repeated spot where following teeth go through the same place. This naturally sort of produces a flatter surface because of that. So those are the ones that I tend to use. Hope that helps. Right, question number 11. How do you tidy up the front and backs after carving the outer surfaces, especially the channels? And what sort of finish do you aim for? As it can become quite messy around the edges, especially the front, with lots of marks, pits and troughs. Do you go for a smooth finish, or is a rough and ready look preferred? Okay, interesting question. Right, there are certain things to understand here. One is the difference between flat and smooth. Okay, so I like a surface that looks like it's handmade. So I like everything, you know, the actual curves to be constant and true. I don't want there to be divots in the curves. I don't want there to be things that look wrong in terms of the actual shape and form of the instrument. So the actual underlying shape and form must be true, must be carried through, must be executed well. However, at a little sort of local level on the surface, I really do not mind seeing individual sort of thumb plane tracks, carving lines and so on. But what I do aim for is smoothness. So I actually will if there's, I mean, I don't tend to use too much sandpaper in construction, but on the front particularly, I might use a very fine sandpaper, 800 or finer, in areas where I have got marks from the thumb plane or something, to actually just give those marks a sort of a look of age, if you like. So they're sort of, the sharp edges are taken out of them. So that's my approach. As I say, the actual curves, the form wants to be true and as accurate as possible. I don't mind seeing little local signs that a human has been there rather than the machine. But I do like it to be smooth in as much as there should, the freshness has been taken out of those marks, if that makes sense. So it's a bit of a vague answer. I hope that helps. And the last question, I see your shop can get cold and then you heat it up. And I assume humidity also goes up and down. Do those swings get factored into your builds at all? Or do you just build and deal with whatever happens when it happens? I don't take them into account. However, one thing I'm very careful about is that the workshop is dry. So, it's not so damp that I get condensation on the tools and rust forming. Having said that, I did notice when I picked this up to show you, there is just a couple of little bits of rust on this one, which is slightly worrying. But, most of the tools that are in the open here in the workshop all the time, there is absolutely no rust at all. For example, scraper and so on that's been kicking around on a bench for years. There's, it's fine. If I had rust forming on my tools, it would drive me mad, basically. So, no, I mean, it's not that damp. Yeah, sometimes it is cold, for sure. Has been the last few days. I think, where are we now? That's 37 minutes. I think that's probably quite long enough for everybody. I'm going to turn the diesel heater on. So in the background, whilst I work, I will have that little sort of tick, tick, tick going on. Sorry, it wasn't a clock. Right, that's it. Okay, look after yourselves. Cheers, folks. Bye.